Tonight, an extraordinary turn in the long-running inquiry into the convictions of Kathleen Folbigg, the New South Wales woman found guilty of murdering her 4 children. Caleb, Patrick, Sarah and Laura died separately between 1989 and 1999. They were all under the age of 2. Kathleen Folbigg, who spent 19 years in jail, has always maintained her innocence. Now, scientific evidence of a rare genetic condition affecting 2 of the children has been accepted as grounds for reasonable doubt over Folbigg's conviction. Kathleen Folbigg's lawyer, Rhanee Rego, joins me now. Rhanee, welcome to 7:30.
It's great to be here with you.
Have you spoken to Kathleen Folbigg recently?
I spoke to her this morning before, of course, the remainder of the submissions have been made, and we'll be catching up for a full briefing tomorrow.
And what is her state of mind at the moment?
I think you could properly describe it as cautiously optimistic, given the nature, long-standing history of her case. She's, of course, cautious, but she feels very hopeful.
Now, the most significant evidence in this inquiry was about a genetic variant that Kathleen Folbigg shared with her daughters, both of whom died. Why is that evidence so significant?
It's really groundbreaking evidence, and in 2003, when Kathleen Folbigg was in trial, the whole genome hadn't yet been mapped, so it would have been impossible to have found anything of this nature. But with the advancements in science and medicine, we've been able to identify novel variants of human disease, really serious variants, such as the one possessed by the 2 girls and Kathleen. So it is a remarkable scientific discovery, not only implications in Australia for this case, but for worldwide knowledge.
And in terms of how it affects her case, why is it so important? What does it tell us about the possibility of what happened to the girls in particular?
Well, at the trial, of course, Caleb, Patrick, Sarah and Laura, well, except in the case of Laura, which I'll come to in a moment, but Caleb was diagnosed as dying from SIDS. Of course, it's a diagnosis of exclusion. And in Patrick's case, he had epilepsy, but albeit from an unidentified cause from where it came. Sarah was also diagnosed with SIDS, and Laura had myocarditis, a heart infection, but that was not given at the time as her cause of death. So there's always been a little ambiguity in terms of the precise cause that killed these children. So the genetic evidence is now bringing a known cause to the deaths of the children, and that's what has been the impetus for this inquiry and has been examined in depth at this inquiry.
Now, there have been different views expressed in the past about the likelihood that this rare variant caused the deaths. What made it so persuasive this time that it might lead to Kathleen Folbigg's release from prison?
Well, at the 2019 inquiry, that is where this genetic variant, CALM2 G114R, was raised first. It was in its infancy of knowledge at that time, although we had some very good evidence to predict how that might have caused the deaths of the 2 girls. But since that time, there has been specific tests that have been undertaken on this variant, which was the subject of published literature in March 2021. I think it was November, but ultimately published in March 2021. And what that found was that at a molecular level, this variant is arrhythmogenic, meaning it can cause the heart to stop. So that further testing was really a pivotal moment in this case, because it gave us the precise, testing to illustrate the effect that this variant had. So that acted as somewhat of a springboard for this inquiry. And what has made it groundbreaking is we've had people who are the best in their fields from around the world come here to talk to us about this variant. And we've had people like Professor Peter Schwartz, Michael Toft-Overgaard, Matt Nygaard, of whom the latter 2 discovered the first comodulin variant in humans. So we've had this wealth of specific expertise that this inquiry has thoroughly looked at and taken evidence from world-leading experts.
So without the science, there wouldn't have been another inquiry, would there?
Well, that was certainly the Governor's, the evidence that caused the doubt that gave rise to this inquiry. But of course, our position has always been that Kathleen Folbigg should have never been charged, let alone taken to trial, a position that we will never deviate from. And we have very good reasons for that, of course.
So at the same time, she now has an answer, in fact, to what happened to the girls, that they died of heart disease. Or a heart condition, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So in the 2 girls' case, they inherited it from Kathleen Folbigg, but they had different factors that that led to their death while Kathleen's still alive. Because a lot of people say to me, well, Rhanee, how is Kathleen still alive with the same variant? And what was found, and it was only very recently found, is that there was what we call a modifier gene, which can have either an aggravating effect or a positive effect. But in this case, it was called, well, it's an aggravating modifier gene. So that then basically was like sort of a barrel of dynamite, you lit it, and that's what acted in causing the two girls' hearts to stop, whereas Kathleen doesn't have that modifier gene.
And just briefly, of course, the overwhelming thing about this tragic case is that 4 children lost their lives. Now, there was something called Meadows Law. What was that, and why was it so significant in shaping the case?
So Meadows Law, just briefly, originated from a very prominent paediatrician called Sir Roy Meadow in the UK. And he famously brought to prominence a dogma, a very unscientific dogma, that was 1, infant death is a tragedy, 2, suspicious, and 3rd is murder until proven otherwise. So really a presumption that if you have a 3rd infant die, you have to then prove otherwise. I mean, but I would just like to echo the statements of Professor Stephen Cordner, who is Australia's leading forensic pathologist. In cases in which there are SIDS, and the factor that it is a diagnosis of exclusion.
And to be clear, that was the cause of death
for 2 of the children, yes. It's an enigma. We still don't know why children die, sadly. And to quote him, there is no merit in forcing certainty where uncertainty exists. And that was certainly the position at trial, but of course now we have further evidence which gives the children, albeit Caleb, he's still diagnosed of SIDS, an identifiable natural cause of death.
I want to talk to you about the diaries because, of course, they've been very significant, and they were very significant in shaping the original prosecution. How do we look at the diaries now? How has our understanding changed about the nature of the diaries through the inquiry?
Well, I think in 2003, of course we weren't in the dark ages then, but I think the diaries were treated as though we were in the dark ages. They were brought forward by the prosecution and the police as if there was only one interpretation. That is, Kathleen Folbigg was admitting to harming her children. And I want to be very clear that nowhere in the 50,000 plus words, and I've transcribed them so I know there are that many, there is nowhere that Kathleen Folbigg says anything that could be interpreted as an admission of agency. And that's really a very important point that a linguist, David Butt, has brought up before, that I think what we've done is mistake the notion of parental responsibility for agency. And there has been no agency ever, such as I did this or I did that. Now, I know that a lot of people listening in here tonight will hold misconceptions about these diaries. And of course, if you're listening to snippets on the news or the trial, you know, Sarah left with a bit of help. I acknowledge that people could be concerned with that. But what has been missing in this case since 1999 was a genuine attempt to actually understand the context in which these diaries were written. And to the credit of this inquiry, they have spent a significant amount of time investigating the context to seek to understand, well, what do these diary entries mean? How were they written? Why were they written? As a therapeutic tool? What was Kathleen Folbigg thinking at the time? What was she feeling? I mean, these are words on a page. Without context, they are simply that.
And the crucial ones were written at a time when she was trying to understand the death of 3 of her children.
That's exactly right. So the entries that the prosecution claimed were the most inculpatory of her guilt, and they classified it as the strongest evidence you could have of her guilt, to putting that in context, were that she had lost her 3rd child, and she was coming to grips with thinking, how did this happen? Doctors had been saying to her, we can't tell you exactly why your children died. And so she was seeking answers. I mean, I think it's quite a plain, really, it's really kind of simple if you think of it in common sense. I mean, a woman is seeking to understand, you know, what more could I have done if I had have just been 5 minutes more? But of course, those who seek to, keep her guilt maintained would say, oh, well, you need to, why didn't she write certain things? Well, it's not for them to say. This is not their diary.
And clearly, in the work of the inquiry and the lawyers, we've arrived at a very different place. We'll watch carefully to see what happens next. But in the meantime, Rhanee Rego, thank you very much. Rhanee Rego, my apologies. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
It's a pleasure, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you.